You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good evening from Washington, D.C. My name is Satu Lemay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center, as well as Director of the East-West Center in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever you are today. I know people are joining us from the region, from the West Coast, from the East Coast, all over, and including Europe. So we welcome you all to this East-West Center webinar. And we're absolutely delighted today to have Mr. Sebastian Strangio with us. He is the author of a very compelling new book that I have not read every word of, but have dipped into and I highly recommend to you. It is called In the Dragon's Shadow, Southeast Asia in the Chinese Century. So Sebastian is looking ahead already. And he is, as many of you know, and probably why you're joining us, a very keen, longtime observer of the region. He currently is the Southeast Asia editor at The Diplomat. But he has reported from the region extensively, including a book that he's written also for Yale University Press on Hun Sen's Cambodia. So we welcome you, Sebastian. We welcome all our participants from wherever they are. And I hope you will keep in mind that today's program is on the record. It is being simultaneously or concurrently live streamed on YouTube. And therefore, the protocol is very simple. Everything that Sebastian says is on the record and being recorded, and as are the question and answer period, which we will have approximately 20 to 30 minutes prior to the close of the program for discussion, questions, and answers. So I'd ask you to put items in the Q&A section, which I will read as the YouTube viewers cannot see the questions and will want to know what Sebastian is responding to. With that, I want to maximize the time for Sebastian to talk about this very timely and compelling topic and his new book, which is not actually released till September 22nd. So we will put a link into the chat section where you can get a copy of the book should you so desire. With that, welcome, Sebastian. Thank you so much for joining us from Adelaide, Australia. Welcome.
Thank you, Satu, for that very kind introduction. And it's a privilege to be here. This is the first US-based book discussion that I've done since the book was released in the UK last month. So, you know, I'm very grateful for you providing the venue for me to talk a little bit about it. So I first got interested in this subject when I was back in 2008 when I arrived in Cambodia as a journalist. I went on to work in Cambodia for 8 years. I left in 2016. And over the course of those 8 years, the change in terms of China's visible economic presence in the country was remarkable. I mean, during those 8 years, you know, China went from being, you know, it became the country's leading trading partner. It's probably its leading foreign investor. It's #1 source of tourists, and you know, an increasingly visible presence around the capital Phnom Penh and in other parts of the country. Chinese bridges arced across the waters of the Mekong River. Chinese highways were opening up, you know, remote parts of the country. And Chinese expatriate business people, students, and tourists were becoming more visible than ever before. For another reason, Cambodia offers an interesting, you know, window onto the question of China's influence in Southeast Asia as a whole, and indeed globally. One of the interesting things about Cambodia that I noticed while I was working there is the extent to which Cambodia was is a symbol of, or it became a symbol of the liberal New World Order that was supposedly came into being at the end of the Cold War. In 1992, the UN arrived in Cambodia on a $1 billion peacekeeping mission, and the aim of which was to end Cambodia's chronic endemic civil war and re-establish the country as a liberal democracy. So Cambodia, and there was a huge amount of money that was fed into this project to transform Cambodia into a democratic state. And so in some ways, Cambodia became a symbol of the world that was supposedly coming into being at the end of the Cold War, in which, this was the unipolar era in which the United States was unchallenged by anybody. And American values and visions of global order, all of these things were in the ascendant. Flash forward to 2020, and we see a nation which reflects not the, sort of the final victory of liberalism globally, but reflects its contingency and fragility. I think that China's rise in Cambodia has, is symbolized a wider shift in the balance of power and prestige in Southeast Asia, and also, one could argue, more globally. So, as I became interested in this sort of Cambodia as this sort of reflector of changing regional and global trends, I began traveling the region more widely as a journalist. And one of the things that I was always kind of keeping an eye out for was the increasing widening footprint of the People's Republic of China, and I became very interested in looking at Chinese investments, how they interacted with local contexts, and how China was perceived in the region in a more in terms of the histories that these countries had, with China going right back to imperial times. And what I found, and what comes through in the book, and what I try to communicate in the book, in Southeast Asia, is that views of China are deeply fraught and anguished. On the one hand, you have the lure of economic opportunity, the being plugged into China's giant economy and riding to prosperity in China's wake. But this coexists intimately with fear and trepidation about what a powerful China will mean for the region's future and for the nations within it. And this state of tension between fear and opportunity is the tension in which the relationship between the region and China exists. And this tension, of course, is growing, is heightening as tensions between China and the United States begin to escalate. So at the fundamental level, I think this Southeast Asia's position vis-a-vis China is deeply informed by the reality of its geographic proximity to China. For centuries, these two regions have been bound together by bonds of trade, tribute, economic interactions of various kinds, and flows of people, mostly immigrants from southern China into Southeast Asia, but also movement in the other direction as well. And in fact, to speak of Southeast Asia and China as separate spheres is in some ways ahistorical. For large parts of history, the boundary between these two regions was hazy. Yunnan province in the south of China once had more in common with the Buddhist kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia than it did with the heartland of Chinese civilization in the Yellow River Valley. And the southern Chinese people who migrated in large numbers to the Malay archipelago and the maritime littorals of Southeast Asia had as much in common with the people of Vietnam as they did with the Mandarin-speaking Han Chinese of North and Northeast China. But today, for China, Southeast Asia is a region of crucial strategic importance, in large part because of this geographic proximity. And I think the reasons can be explained by the challenging security environment that the Chinese face in Asia. Looking out from Beijing, China's neighborhood looks like a claustrophobic place. The country is hemmed in by nuclear armed rivals, including Russia and India, and US treaty allies, including the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan. Hemmed in on every side by powerful rivals, Southeast Asia is sort of the one place where where there is no dominant major power. And it is a place where the Chinese have always perceived that they could break the chain of encirclement that they have always perceived as being drawn in around them. Now, this became ever more important in the 1980s and 90s when China's economy began growing, and it became increasingly reliant on access to global markets, both for its exports, but also for the imports of fuel and other important resources that help to drive forward China's manufacturing industry. And so the question of how to secure China's access to these markets became ever more pressing. In particular, the Chinese were very aware that the Straits of Malacca, lying between the island of Sumatra and Peninsula Malaya, were a choke point that made China's economy acutely vulnerable to some sort of naval blockade by a hostile power, usually perceived to be the United States. And so, it is in this sort of insecurity that China's maximalist claims over the South China Sea originate. I think that China views this important seaway much in the same way that the United States viewed the Caribbean from the end of the 19th century as sort of its own domain. And because of the trillions of dollars of trade that pass through this ocean every year, a region that is vital to China's economic future. Now, this is, of course, has been veiled over by claims about China's historical connection, its historical claims over this maritime region, and it has become a subject of acute nationalist focus within China. But I think all of these things exist downstream from a basic strategic consideration, which is to sort of establish control on the important seaways upon which the Chinese economy relies, and prevent it from being hemmed in, blockaded, and contained by a hostile outside power. At the same time, the things that make Southeast Asia a particularly important region for China also make it a particularly challenging region. Now, part of this is simply the flip side of China's size and proximity to the region. I think that these things would be bound to prompt a degree of fear and suspicion, almost irrespective of the policies of the Chinese state. But the Chinese, People's Republic of China also, there's a lot of baggage associated with the past policies of the PRC in the region, including its support for communist insurgencies across the region during the Cold War, and the perception that China is seeking to meddle with the loyalties of ethnic Chinese communities scattered across the region. In recent years, the proximity of China in Southeast Asia has increased markedly. In the mainland parts of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, new infrastructure networks have broken down what was once a thick and nearly impermeable barrier of mountains and forests that once kept Chinese power far away. In imperial times, the Chinese occasionally did send military expeditions through these mountains into what is now mainland Southeast Asia, but they often fared poorly in the malarial mountain regions, and this was a region that was extremely remote from the centers of power in the imperial capital. One indication of this is that the distribution of ethnic Chinese populations throughout Southeast Asia was most sparse in the regions directly bordering China itself, for reasons that it was simply incredibly difficult to cross through these mountains. There were people that did, traders and so forth, but for the most part, China's interactions with Southeast Asia took place by sea. And so, at least its commercial interactions. And so, all that has changed over the past couple of decades. These two regions are now linked by highways, rail lines, and special economic zones. Not all of them planned or built by China. A lot of them have been were funded after the Cold War by the Japanese government under the ADB. But the effect that this has had is to reorient, to at least some extent, the economies of the Mekong region. These new infrastructure networks have opened up the region to a transformative southward sweep of Chinese investment and immigration. And we also have, of course, the Chinese damming of the upper reaches of the Mekong River, which lie within China's borders, which is essentially, or at least according to some research, has given Chinese engineers effectively the ability to choke off the flow of one of Southeast Asia's great rivers. And this has raised acute questions of food insecurity and for the nations lying downstream. We see a similar sort of development at sea, where over the past 3 decades, China has broken with centuries of continental land-bound focus and ventured out into the oceans in a way that is historically quite anomalous in China and the sweep of Chinese history. Historically, the oceans were probably an even more impermeable barrier to the extension of Chinese state power. While a huge amount of commercial interaction took place by sea, the Chinese traders roamed as far, from Borneo to Siam, trading all manner of goods. The Chinese state itself, disdained the oceans historically as a sort of world of chaos, as a region that couldn't be tamed by the usual methods of imperial administration. Of course, this, the attention, the security concerns of the Chinese state were always to the north and west. There was always the concern that, the fierce steppe peoples like the Mongols, the Manchus, and the Xiongnu, who had historically posed some of the gravest threats to the security of the Chinese state, would sweep down and and topple the dynasty. So, the Chinese state was always focused on land warfare, securing its land borders, and keeping this sort of barbarian hordes, as they saw them, at bay. But again, since the 1980s or so, what we've seen is the Chinese, state begin to build up a powerful Chinese navy to secure the vital sea lanes that I discussed earlier. And as on the mainland, we see mammoth infrastructure projects. In this case, the dredging and construction of artificial island fortresses in remote parts of the South China Sea, which have collapsed the distance that once separated China from the peoples and states of of archipelagic Southeast Asia. So, from the foothills of the Himalayas all the way to sort of the Banda Sea and the eastern part of the Malay archipelago, the distance that once separated the Chinese state from the peoples and governments of Southeast Asia has collapsed. China is closer to the region than ever before. Now, as this proximity has increased, so has the concern about, what this will mean for the region. It has called to mind China's past interference in the region, its support for communism in virtually every nation of the region in the 1960s and 70s. And as I mentioned before, it's also stirred up old dormant fears about the ethnic Chinese communities of Southeast Asia, whose relationship with the Chinese homeland has always been a subject of acute anxiety throughout Southeast Asia, and this is something that I'll talk about a bit further. Another recent problem that China has faced in the region is its the present attitude of its present government. I think that China's return to wealth and power has also been accompanied by a sort of return to the, I think one can overblow these parallels a little bit, but, the sort of Middle Kingdom syndrome, the sense of China as the sort of center of the world and everything else sort of being peripheral to that. I think that given China's size in the region, it's always going to have a special responsibility to assuage the concerns of the smaller nations that lie to its south. But much of China's recent behavior has achieved much the opposite of that. China's rise has been accompanied by an assumption, I think, that as the largest nation in the region, and the largest economy in the world, Southeast Asian states should defer to Chinese interests and wishes. And in cases where they resist doing so, the Chinese government seems to have a habit of viewing this as it must be the result of ill intention or the malign influence of outside powers, for which read the United States. I think that this sort of imperial high-handedness reflects, on one level, simply the sort of blindness and self-centeredness that afflicts all large powers. But I think there's also an element in which it reflects China's nature as a one-party authoritarian state, and potentially some political residue from its former status as the sort of Middle Kingdom. And when China viewed itself not simply as the most civilized nation in the world, but the very definition of civilization itself. And this tendency, both of these tendencies, I think, have made the current Chinese government awkward at engaging with the Southeast Asian countries, particularly the more open societies in the region, and have made it very difficult in dealing with any group that lies outside the boundaries of the state. Chinese diplomats and officials have often shown a tin ear for the concerns for public opinion and public concerns in Southeast Asia. And even when they are effective at sort of communicating China's position on things and listening to local communities in the region, this is often undermined by attempts to influence and shape the political outcomes in Southeast Asian societies in ways supportive of Chinese interests. So, the outcome of this has been an inability not only to respond effectively to the negative reactions prompted by its rise, but also to the idea that China's actions could arouse such suspicion to begin with. The general message that China is offering the region is essentially one of flourishing within China's orbit or languishing outside of it. And I think, in this category, one also has to include the recent attempts to broaden China's outreach to the ethnic Chinese populations of Southeast Asia. As in the past, this remains one of the most sensitive and potentially combustible elements of Chinese engagement with Southeast Asia. In fact, in a lot of nations of the region, this is a more acute concern for the man or woman on the street than is China's expansion into the South China Sea, for instance. In Malaysia and Indonesia, this is an issue of secondary or tertiary importance to your average person. But the question of China seeking to activate local Chinese populations as they see it in support of Chinese aims, touches on some exposed nerves of nationalism and sovereignty dating back to the early parts of the colonial period when many of these ethnic Chinese first migrated to the region. And so, in some countries where ethnic Chinese have maintained a precarious foothold in the national community dating back to those periods, China's increased outreach is beginning to reawaken or threatens to reawaken old fears of dual loyalties. And this will have two main impacts. One is that it will consistently complicate China's relationships with these countries and throw up obstacles in the way of the pursuit of Chinese goals. The second is that it could, boomerang on these ethnic Chinese communities themselves, who have often been subject to prejudice, discrimination, even violence at periods of rupture. And so I think this is probably, one of the most concerning developments that I've noticed in the region over the past decade or two. Now, of course, alongside all of these concerns, Southeast Asia stands to benefit from a wealthy, prosperous, and stable China. And the region does not necessarily agree with the position that's taking hold in the United States at the moment, which is that China is a threat to its neighbors, a threat to the very idea of freedom itself. I think dwelling so close to China, the Southeast Asian nations don't have the luxury of seeing things in quite such a binary way. And the reality is that in most ways, a prosperous and stable China is in the region's interests. The opposite, of course, would be to its detriment, for sure. Southeast Asians remember well that at periods of internal rupture within China, when at times of dynastic collapse or civil war, the region has often experienced destabilizing flows of people to the south. They also much prefer the present China to the China of Mao Zedong, who actively sought to stoke revolution and undermine sovereign governments throughout Southeast Asia. So as much as they might fear or oppose its power, the flip side is that China has become a vital economic partner, if not the most prominent one, to virtually every nation in the region. And Chinese schemes like the Belt and Road Initiative, while posing challenges for the nations of the region, also have definite attractions, especially for the the poor developing nations that desperately need to build out their infrastructure and move up the developmental ladder. And so for this reason, most of the region has chosen to take part in Chinese initiatives like the BRI and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, reckoning that the risks of participation are outweighed by the benefits of doing so. So the twin factors of geographic proximity and economic entanglement make China something that the nations of Southeast Asia cannot feasibly ignore or wish away. It also tends to make the region resistant to signing up to any US-led alliance or coalition of states aimed, explicitly or otherwise, at containing China's power. And herein, I think we see the fundamentally agnostic Southeast Asian view of the Indo-Pacific strategy that's been promulgated by the Trump administration. And I'm happy to expand on that further in Q&A. There's one other important area of shared interest between Southeast Asia and China, which I think is important to mention. And this is the two regions' shared anti-colonial orientation and heritage. Both regions had similar experiences of Western imperialism. Both, experienced the contusions of encounter with Western power in the 19th century and earlier, and the nationalism to which that gave birth. And this sort of history of anti-colonial resistance has produced a similarly has profoundly shaped the attitudes of both China and the Southeast Asian nations with regard to the international system. And I think that this has inculcated a number of common perspectives. The most important of these is this zealous commitment to the norm of national sovereignty and an extreme allergy to any hint of being told what to do or any hint that an outside power is seeking to abridge the nation's sovereignty. It's also given birth to potent nationalism in virtually every nation in the region, which China, of course, shares. And so I think that China's promotion of an international order based around the principle of national sovereignty is something that the region in general supports. So one thing I note in my book is this persistent pattern over the past couple of decades when Western nations, including the US, pressure or criticize Southeast Asian governments over, democratic backsliding or human rights abuses. They always tend to shift towards China in support, and they're very, the region's governments are, very much in favor of China's, non-interference approach to doing business. Now, there are tensions within this, of course, because China's own actions are beginning to acquire, a certain imperial character in some people's minds. So, this is not a stable dynamic. But I think that it generally holds true. This view of this emphasis on national sovereignty is broadly shared within the region, and this provides one of China's main one could even describe it as a form of soft power. It's no strings form of engagement, and the fact that China will never lecture another government about how to run its affairs. And for all these reasons, this also feeds into the suspicion and concern that the region, in general, has towards the recent hostile turn in American attitudes towards China. The research of this book and the writing of it coincided with, a strikingly bipartisan souring of perspectives on China. I mean, it seems like one of the few things that commands bipartisan support in Washington nowadays. And this new American consensus, is gone from viewing China as an economic partner and that potential stakeholder in the international system to a predatory power that bullies its neighbors, that seeks to export its authoritarian system, and uses debt traps to ensnare small developing nations. And the current U.S. administration has been fond of framing the challenge of China in starkly categorical and ideological terms. It's a global struggle between democracy and freedom. And this image is often set alongside, I think quite an idealized vision of American primacy and the US-led liberal international order that China is allegedly working to supplant. But the depiction of US-China competition as an all-or-nothing struggle between democracy and dictatorship has failed to gain much purchase in Southeast Asia. I think the region has memories of exactly what the forging of the liberal international order involved in the region. I mean, it's easy to forget that this included this process of ordering included the destructive American intervention in Vietnam, carpet bombings in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and American support for the massacre of communists and supposed communists in Indonesia in the mid-1960s. And so I think there's a certain amount of baggage that the United States has in the region, perhaps less than China's, the concerns about the PRC and its history in the region, but it's something that I think plays into how these, how Southeast Asian nations view the United States, and also to an extent how they view China. In general, the Southeast Asian nations see no reason why they can't continue to have good economic ties with China, while also maintaining friendly relations with the United States and other large powers, even when those powers are in fierce disagreement between themselves. But at a time of increasing superpower tension, this has put Southeast Asia in an increasingly, a liminal bind between these two superpowers. It's sort of the fear and concern about China, feeds into and interacts with the concern about, the potential for a conflict in the region, and the desire, of course, and the reliance of the region upon China for trade and investment. So this lure and opportunity, and the lure of opportunity and the fear of China's expanding power, exists now in almost a state of sort of a dialectical relationship, feeding backward and forward into one another, and producing a deep and abiding ambivalence about China's resurgence and return as a major power. And as tensions between the US and China continue to increase, this is placing additional strain on Southeast Asia's ability to maintain its strategic autonomy. So in general, in conclusion, a more powerful, ambitious, and belligerent China has posed each of the nations in Southeast Asia with a similar challenge: how to benefit from China's economic rise while safeguarding their national sovereignty from over-dependence on China or other Chinese actions. Within these broad parameters, each nation has met the challenge in different ways. Within and between countries, there is a great deal of divergence in perceptions of China and in the responses that nations have taken in response to its rise. And I'm happy to talk about more specific countries in the Q&A if people are interested. But with relations between China and the US, in free fall and competition becoming more heated, this challenge is becoming ever more acute and the balancing act trickier to maintain. Yet Southeast Asia has always been a crossroad of superpowers, and in many senses, no region is better equipped in terms of its history and strategic culture to bend with the changing regional winds and preserve its freedom of maneuver in a new age of superpower competition. Thank you.
Well, wonderful, Sebastian. Thank you. And I think all of us would agree why it's so beneficial to have your book and your perspectives, because they are so deeply informed and thoughtful and engaging. So I want to thank you, first of all, for that terrific overview of your book and of your research in the region. Before going to questions, I just want to make a couple of points that came to my mind. You kind of ended on one, so I'll return to it. I was struck by your starting point of the early 1990s on the history and the sort of Cambodian peace process and the idea of a new liberal order and how Cambodia became a symbol. I guess from an American point of view, perhaps, I saw Southeast Asia and Cambodia even as a sort of, at the end of the Cold War, as a less focused place of US activity. Not no activity, but comparatively less at the end of the Cold War for the first decade. And indeed, the sort of precipitating events for the American consciousness, such as they were in the early 1990s, were removal of our bases in the Philippines and the pickup by Singapore, the kind of focus on Europe and post-Soviet NATO, the spread of three blocks, the EU, I guess it was the EC at that time, and NAFTA, and then the East Asian project, really led by Japan, not by China in the 1990s. So first of all, it's very interesting, the framing that you have of when the historical phase begins, and what really kicks it off, and for me on Southeast Asia for Americans, is really 9/11 and the kind of deep return with the simultaneous rise of China initiated by the first George W. Bush administration. So that's just a historical comment for framing, because I think it's important how Southeast Asians see us and China at these different junctures where we enter the fray over the last 3 decades. And so I've been kind of thinking through how it means. Let me ask you 2 specific questions before I turn to the Q&A. One is, you ended on the note of Southeast Asian agency and strategic culture. As you well know, Thailand managed to have a relationship simultaneously with both the Axis and the Allies, became a US treaty ally in '54. Vietnam managed to basically deal with every member of the UN, permanent member of the UN Security Council in some conflict, with the exception of the British. But the British were present right after World War II in occupying parts of Vietnam, or being present militarily in Vietnam. So you have a history of countries kind of maneuvering, navigating, balancing. Do you feel that skill, that strategic culture is the phrase you use, has that atrophied? Is the dynamics changed sufficiently enough that their bandwidth for doing it has altered? And the second question is, I know your book is on how Southeast Asia and the Chinese century, and focused on Southeast Asian views, primarily China, and you alluded to the US, but I want to dig a little bit deeper. Do Southeast Asians perceive the US at this point, either because of its trajectory vis-a-vis China or for other reasons, has the same stake in Southeast Asia that China does? Or is it beginning to have the same stake as China does because of the rise of China? I just wondered how you, as you travel and talk to people and are on the ground talking to officials, what you pick up. So maybe I'll start there, and then I will go to the Q&A.
Sure. Well, on the question of strategic culture, I think that one thing I think it's very important to emphasize is that the region, and I apologize if my talk gave this impression, but the region is not simply a matter of the US and China. It is a naturally multipolar region, especially with India also returning to its former status as a great power. We have, powers like Australia, South Korea, Japan is probably the most significant. Even Russia, the European Union is closely engaged in the region economically, at least. And so, the presence of all these other powers does give the Southeast Asian states a considerable amount of room for maneuver. And I think that we continue to see that, Southeast Asian governments are very good at performing this dance between the various external powers that have, an agenda in the region. Even the way that the Thai government, since the 2014 coup, was able to sort of dance towards China in order to communicate a sort of distaste with the American attitude towards the coup. But then as soon as Donald Trump came into office in 2017, there was, General Prayut came dancing toward Washington again. And I think that it's holding the two major powers in a very delicate balance, while also, continuing to engage strongly with the Japanese, and who are crucial to the future health of Thailand's manufacturing economy. And one can see similar dances probably in most countries. So I think that, yeah, I think that there is room for maneuver there. It's not quite as binary as the old Cold War was, which is also one of the reasons that I argue against this sort of binary perception of competition as this ideological struggle. I think the region, has a stake on both sides in a way that it didn't during the Cold War. In terms of views of the United States and whether the U.S. has a stake in the region, I think that it's true that this is China's backyard in many ways. It is to China what the Caribbean is to the United States, and China is seeking, in essence, to sort of declare a Monroe Doctrine in the region. Of course, it's much more complicated in Asia than it is in the Western Hemisphere, precisely because there are all of these outside powers who have their own security concerns, a lot of them to do with China, and are not going to acquiesce, at least easily, to China's desire to establish a sphere of influence in the region. I think for the United States, there's always this problem of, the fact that the region is so far away. It's separated by thousands of miles of the Pacific Ocean, and given America's global security commitments, there's always been the sense in which Southeast Asia is sort of it sits downstream from America's concerns and focus on China. And I think there's a perception in the region that when the U.S. wants something from Southeast Asia, it pledges undying fealty to the region and is very willing to say the right things. But when the rubber hits the road, it often is, American policies don't seem responsive often to the development needs of the region. The Trump administration perhaps is an outlier because it's, but there is this perception that, it's asking nations to, by depicting competition with China in ideological terms, it is asking countries to pick a side. So you're either on the side of freedom or you're on the side of authoritarianism. Of course, the situation in Southeast Asia is so much more complex than that, and it's impossible to categorize the nation in such a simplistic way. But there's a sense that American strategists are looking across the Pacific Ocean at China, eyeing it offbeatedly, but that Southeast Asia is sort of forgotten in the middle, and that that despite all the talk about the Indo-Pacific, there is all of this has been crafted around a sort of attempt to contain China and curb Chinese ambitions, and that this sits at a remove from how Southeast Asia views China and what it wants from the relationship.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sebastian. Let me now go to the Q&A, and as I mentioned, I will be picking and choosing questions, in part because several questions, at least 3, dealt with the diaspora issue, and you spoke to that quite extensively, so we can come back to it, but I want to pick up some other issues, and I will read them so that Sebastian doesn't have to, and also because our live stream YouTube guests will not be able to see the question. So let me take a very interesting one from our colleague at Harvard, Anu Anwar. Asked, does China see its best interests in a united ASEAN? Or will China pursue a divide and rule strategy to achieve its geopolitical? There's a lot of debate about what, under what conditions does China want a united ASEAN in order to use it to push back the US and other powers, what have you? And when does it break that unity in its So I think that kind of gets at the heart of a question that many of us have been grappling with here.
Yeah, the situation with ASEAN is in a state of flux. I think that the best case scenario for the Chinese government is a united ASEAN that is deferential to Chinese wishes. Mm-hmm. The second priority would be an ASEAN that's internally divided and unable to unite against China in the way that many in the US would like it to. And I think that these goals are pursued sort of on the fly. I think China doesn't want to destroy ASEAN. I think that it would prefer to capture it. Whether that's possible, again, I think ASEAN, in some ways encapsulates the sort of the liminal position that Southeast Asia, faces. It's unable to fully unite on the question of superpower tensions and issues like the South China Sea, but it is also unlikely to break apart fully, because ASEAN has always brought together nations with vastly divergent political goals, cultures, on every metric, it represents a region of incredible diversity. And also nations that have had, in the past, their own conflicts between themselves. And so I think that it still remains the region's best hope for, maintaining some strategic agency. But it is coming under pressure from both sides to either defer to Chinese wishes, or, and then there's also pressure from the US side that ASEAN should band together and stand up and kind of create a unified front against China. But unfortunately, ASEAN's expansion in the 90s has increased its diversity to such an extent. The inclusion of countries like Myanmar that have a very different orientation, as regards issues like the South China Sea, than do the nations that are actually facing the Chinese Coast Guard and Navy. That, it's made consensus on all of these issues very difficult to attain. And so, ASEAN's future is, I think it will continue to muddle through, pursue the consensus upon which it, its decisions are based, and I think it will survive, but I think it's never going to fulfill the promises or the hopes that a lot of Western observers would wish for it.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the next question, which is from our senior fellow and senior advisor here at the East-West Center in Washington, Dr. Ellen Frost. Some of you will know her book on rival regionalisms. So she asks a question really about public opinion in the region. She talks specifically about, the president in the Philippines seems to be viscerally anti-American, but the Philippine public, the polling data is quite favorable. In Vietnam, the government is, keeping good relations with the US, but, the public has particularly high regard for the United States. If I might say, even under this administration, because you mentioned about this administration creating some cleavages. So I don't mean that politically, I just mean even under this administration where there have been some down, Vietnam, India, Philippines are kind of outliers where there's still very strong feelings, positive feelings towards the US.
Sure.
So I want to ask you about public opinion, quite apart from elites that Ellen is asking, and also to refer again to that ICE's annual survey on elite opinion, which is quite interesting. Which is everyone thinks China is big, the more important than the US, at least in public, in that opinion survey, in the elite opinion survey. And yet, overwhelmingly, they're extremely worried about it. And they're most worried in countries adjacent to China, mainland Southeast Asia. So I wondered if you could talk about Ellen's public opinion question in light of both mainland and maritime, as well as public versus elite.
Yeah, well, so public opinion, one thing that's really important to emphasize is that the US has a massive advantage in Southeast Asia and globally, arguably too, which is that it has a genuine form of soft power. This is something that the Chinese have never quite gotten, I don't think, that the idea that soft power is not something that is formulated by the party and trickles downwards. Like a lot of American soft power has not been a conscious thing. It's something that's emerged from the ferment of American society. And one of the most interesting things about American soft power is that it's actually emerged often in opposition to the US, the authorities in the US and things like that. I mean, rock and roll was often an oppositional, cultural language. And I think that's something that really appealed to, say, youth east of the Iron Curtain in the 1970s and 80s. And so, and arguably helped bring down the Soviet Union to some extent. So I think that when you look at views of America are generally, not universally, but genuinely pretty positive across the region. And this is a real advantage that the US has. I think part of the reason as well is that it's so distant from the region that it doesn't sort of stimulate the same concerns that that China does. And so, yeah, I think that Vietnam and the Philippines, even then, do seem to be outliers. I think that the Vietnamese fear of China is probably the most acute of any nation in the region. And so any nation that can help Vietnam stand up to this sort of perennial, eternal sort of enemy north of the border is hugely welcomed by the Vietnamese public. And I think that Vietnam is one case where you see very strong grassroots mobilization on the question of the South China Sea, where everywhere else, even in the Philippines, this issue is sort of, there are protests in the Philippines when China, bullies Filipino fishermen around in the Spratly Islands. But in general, this is not an issue that has people massing spontaneously in the way that it does in Vietnam. And I think the Philippines is also somewhat of an outlier in that it has this intimate relationship with the United States. I mean, some surveys have shown that attitudes in the Philippines towards the United States are even more positive than they are in the United States itself. And I think this has been nourished by generations of intermarriage, migration, the imprint that the United States left on the Philippines when it was colonial power there. The rest of the region, things are slightly more mixed. I mean, Thailand, very interestingly, the last survey results that the Pew Center did in 2014 found that, strong approval for both China and the United States, around 75%, with strong, favorable. But, in the Muslim parts of maritime Southeast Asia, views of the United States have tended to be a bit more mixed. So in Indonesia, it seems to have oscillated wildly with changes in administration. Barack Obama was hugely popular, obviously because of his connection with Indonesia. But Trump, like the approval ratings after Trump came to office, dropped quite sharply. So I think, anyway, to sum up, I think this is a very important form of advantage that the United States has in the region. But I think that how that feeds, at the elite level, people are making decisions based on, they're being actually faced with the hard decisions about how to balance the US off against China. And while it's for a man or woman on the street in Ho Chi Minh City who is angry about what the Chinese Coast Guard is doing in the Spratly Islands and Chinese actions offshore, the situation facing the Vietnamese Communist Party is immensely more complicated, given their country's reliance on China economically, the good relations that exist historically, at least to some extent, between the two communist parties, and the fact that they're prepared to fight China if necessary, but they also know that they don't want a war either, and so they need to maintain a sort of stability there. And so elite opinion tends to be a much more ambivalent, and I think the ICA survey really bore that out, that really neither superpower is winning many hearts and minds at the moment. There's a concern with the US that it's episodically engaged in the region, is sort of what I said before, and that it can't really be relied upon. But there's also a flip concern, which I've heard during the research of this book, that if the US is too much involved and too forward, that it could drag the region into a conflict that the region has no interest in. Southeast Asian states want to maintain good relationships with everybody, and they don't feel a necessary stake. So it's very hard in what the US is, it's in competition with China. And so it's very difficult for the US to maintain just the right mix of engagement and distance. And I think that is probably, inevitable given its distance from the region. And the fact that it and China are now the two most powerful nations in the world, and that the Southeast Asia sits sandwiched between the two. But I think, the difference between elite and public opinion can be explained, largely by that. I think that when you're tasked with actually making the decisions, everything starts to look a little bit more gray, and it's it's so that popularity that the US has, it doesn't always feed into decision making in a linear way.
Right, thank you. Let's go to the next one. It's from a journalist at the Voice of America, Changpor On. And the question relates to just hours ago, apparently. I did not know this. The US has invoked the Global Magnitsky Act to sanction the Union Development Group suspected by the US for serving Chinese PLA purposes at Daro Sakor project on the Cambodian coastline, because you lived in Cambodia for many years. I think hence the question. What do you think the implications are of this? And if I could just broaden that question out, quite apart from this particular case, which I, of course, just am reading about. There is, of course, last week's announcement of the 22 entities involved of state-owned enterprises in the South China Sea. How are you seeing in general Southeast Asian responses to these sanctions on particular entities and visa restrictions? Are they following or aligning with those as they look at their BRI and other projects, or are they proceeding apace?
Well, this is a good example of Southeast Asian nations not wanting to be faced with these sorts of choices. I mean, the current administration is constantly said, like, we're not asking you to make a choice, but then they sanction these 20-something Chinese entities, and then they kind of are facing the region with a choice as to whether they deal with these entities or not. And the Philippines, quite interestingly, President Duterte, one of these Chinese firms is being contracted to build, a new airport in Manila. And Duterte said, we are a sovereign nation. We make our own decisions about these things. I think that the Cambodian government is likely to respond to this latest sanction in very much the same way. I think that it has resisted being, told what to do by outside powers. And this is where nationalism injects itself into the equation quite powerfully. I mean, I think one problem that both the United States and China have in Southeast Asia is they underestimate how proud and how sensitive Southeast Asian governments are about being told what to do. In some senses, this is not to say like there's a moral equivalence between China and the US, but there's certainly sort of a parallel in how the region views these two powers as, sort of large, lumbering outside powers with their own interests who, want to make demands upon Southeast Asian governments in pursuit of their wider aims. And so I've seen, so far general broad resistance to these things. I mean, I think that in the Philippines, under the Aquino administration, or potentially under a future administration, you could potentially see the Philippines lining up behind the United States on this question of dealing with specific Chinese firms. The Philippines has always mirrored most closely American rhetoric and perceptions of China. But, in the rest of the region, I think that it's going to be very difficult for governments to make these decisions. Because again, I mean, the US is not coming to the table with an alternative. This has been a pattern that we've seen, again and again with the Huawei 5G technology. The region was sort of, the US requested that the region not accept this technology, possibly for good reason. I mean, there are serious security concerns connected to it, but the fact that Huawei is affordable and more advanced than the competing technologies is precisely the reason they want it. And there was no alternative being offered. And so I think that, the use of unilateral sanctions is something that the region is suspicious of. And I don't see a huge amount of support emerging for this line on China. I think the region is going to wait until the American election. And if Joe Biden is elected, we're not going to see, I don't think, a return to the pre-Trump era of engagement with China, but I do think we're going to see a more coherent and level-headed approach to competition with China, which I think the region will welcome. Oh, you're on mute, Satu.
Sorry about that, folks. Sorry, I forgot to turn myself back on. We are at the appointed time, but if you have a few moments, I know some participants will have to leave, but I'm going to take one last question. It is quite interesting because your book is, of course, filled with case studies and detailed on-the-ground reporting, et cetera. So I thought this would be a good way perhaps to end this discussion. I'm sorry I can't get to all the wonderful questions and discussion. Hugh Lester asks, what is a good example of a country in Southeast Asia balancing the interests of China and the US well? I assume from the perspective of the country in question. And what is a poor example? Can you think of one that's kind of managing this to its national interest, quite apart from whether they're Chinese or US national interests?
Well, every nation, has managed this balancing act within the limits available to them. So I think that a nation that's probably managed it badly has been Cambodia. I mean, the fact that there is the potential of China establishing a military presence, a naval presence on the Cambodian coast, this is not a positive development for Cambodia. And the country, as during the Cold War, runs the risk of being dragged into a superpower conflict once again. But I also think that it's, Cambodia's, the perceptions that the Cambodian leadership has of its choices they perceive that their choices have been narrowed by the fact that Cambodia has become sort of this democracy project. I opened my talk talking about how that, reflected the triumphalism of the early 90s. And I think that Cambodia has always been seen as an unimportant country where we can take a stand on principle. From the Cambodian government's perspective, that's been harnessed by the Cambodian opposition to undermine their hold on power. This is also a country with very zero-sum political culture, which, emerges to some extent from its horrific history of upheaval, war, violence, revolution, genocide. And so, the perception of the Cambodian government would be that, the Western powers have narrowed the options available to it and pushed it into this sort of dependence on China. At the same time, I do think the Cambodians have been unsophisticated in how they've responded to those Western pressures. I think that Hun Sen has allowed his temper and his keen, nationalism and allergy to being lectured to get the better of him as he gets older. And I think that that's led Cambodia into a potentially very dangerous situation. A country that's managed it well, and again, this reflects the resources that this nation has available to it, is Singapore. Singapore has the distinction of being the one nation in the world, I think, that can claim to have a special relationship with both the United States and China. It has, allowed, American military presence in Singapore. It's aided the U.S. in its forward deployment of its Navy and military in Southeast Asia, at the same time as having, a flourishing economic and trade relationship with China that was rooted in warm relationships between Chinese and Singaporean leaders. I think that the fact that Singapore is such an important, hub, its economic and strategic importance is such that, it's enabled it to play that role to a certain extent, but it's also had very able leadership who have been able to draw the country's lines of interest with precision and establish a very clear line as to, what our interests are with regard to the two major powers. And I think Singapore in some ways, an interesting corollary of that is that Singapore, I think, has articulated most clearly the Southeast Asian position to the extent that there is one on US-China competition. And we saw that emerge sort of at, Prime Minister Lee's speech to the Shangri-La dialogue in 2019, in which he sort of said to both powers, you both got to cool it, you both have to find a way to live with each other. And this, I think he disappointed leaders in both countries with that speech. Certainly know that he did the Americans in the audience. And so, I think that Singapore is probably the exemplar in that respect. Whether Singapore's model of very delicate balancing is available to other nations, again, each nation has its own limitations. Remains to be seen. Each nation faces unique limitations and has unique assets which they can bring to this balancing act.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Sebastian. I'm afraid we do, unfortunately, have to end it there, but we will look forward to your next book and further engagement with you. And I want to just highlight before we sort of formally thank you, a couple of upcoming programs that may be of interest. As many of you who are not on our East-West Center in Washington or our East-West Center listservs, newsletters, please consider being on them. We cannot put you on them, but if you it's easy to sign up, and we have a very big list of activities coming up. September 22nd, next week, we have a Building Strategic Leverage in the Indian Ocean with Arzan Tarapur, a former fellow of the East-West Center in Washington, and Dr. Nilanthi Samarnayake of the Center for Naval Analysis. On the 24th, we have the General Accounting Office on a new studies on protecting national security at US universities while maintaining international collaboration, which is a hot topic these days about foreign students and their role in sensitive areas. And we also have a Korean colleague joining us because Korea is also looking at this, as are many other countries in the region. And then on September 29th, also a former fellow at the East-West Center, Dr. Evelyn Goh, will be talking about her new book on China-Japan relations and 4 scenarios under which Sino-Japanese relations may evolve in the current international environment. And finally, on September 30th, science diplomacy on the South China Sea. So as you can see, we have a whole host of programs covering Northeast Asia, national security and foreign exchange on the educational front, Indian Ocean and South China Sea. So I hope you'll join us for one or other, and there are many programs coming up in October as well. And with that, let me once again thank Sebastian Strangio for joining us today from Adelaide. I know it's early morning, still relatively early morning, but thank you for joining us early. And again, his book is here. The link is in the chat section if you'd like to join. And with that, I bid everyone good evening from Washington and good day and good morning wherever else you are. And thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Sebastian. Wonderful job.
Thank you, Satu. I enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.